It's a really incredible honor and pleasure to be here amongst this collection of really brilliant thinkers and doers, activists and scholars. And it's a privilege to be here alongside people I consider visionaries, right, who are daring to imagine, but also to doggedly pursue a more just, a more equitable, a more sustainable world that begins in New Orleans but radiates outwards. I want to thank Professor Tricia Rose and Professor George Lipsitz, the staff of the center, and particularly my good friend, Dr. Jordan Camp. I'm especially pleased to be on this panel with Cindi, Katz, and with my dear, dear friend and one of my greatest teachers, Malik Raheem. I'll say more in a few minutes about how we met and how I came to be sitting here today, because I don't necessarily work on issues of environmental justice, environmental racism, but it has everything to do, of course, with Malik. But I want to say now that, and I've said this on several occasions in the past and other venues, that I've learned as much from Malik Raheem in the time that we spent together at his kitchen table, on his back porch, and driving around the city that he loves so dearly, as I've learned from anyone I've encountered in any of the wonderful, fine, august institutions of higher learning with which I've been associated. Anyone who spends any real time in his presence knows that he's one of the sweetest, gentlest, most giving human beings you will ever meet. You spend just a few minutes talking to him, you will more than likely experience his infectious laughter. You might find yourself wrapped up in a bear hug when you part ways with him. And at the same time, if you have even a passing familiarity with Malik Raheem's history, that reveals him to be a determined warrior for freedom and justice, a fierce defender of his community, and a righteous advocate for the marginalized and the oppressed and the overlooked. He's someone who has very little patience for formalities, for the empty rhetoric of politicians, of academics, or to use one of his favorite phrases, quote unquote, so-called community leaders. But from the early 1970s through the long aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, he's risked his life for the causes in which he believes. He's now in his late 60s, 7 children, 21 grandchildren, and 6 great-grandchildren. But he's no less committed now than he was decades ago. Professor George Lipsitz suggested last night that we often don't give grassroots activists enough credit for their ideas, right? We focus more intently on their deeds, and with the kind of implicit or sometimes even explicit understanding that their ideas originate from somewhere else, right? And we do this at our peril. Like the other activists from whom we'll hear over the course of the day, Malik Raheem is a true intellectual. With only a GED, one that he earned behind prison bars, Malik has, as you will hear, a crystal clear analysis of socio-political conditions in New Orleans and in the Gulf, one that is deeply rooted in both his experience and his understanding of history, particularly the history of Black resistance, from slavery and the Maroons and the rebels under enslavement, to the Garvey movement, to the radical and revolutionary movements of the 1960s and 70s. Which brings us, I think, to the theme of this panel. One of the things that's most striking to me about Malik's vision and his political analysis and the work of Common Ground Collective, the grassroots relief organization that he co-founded in 2005, is the way in which that it marries environmental justice, questions of environmental justice, with the no less pressing concerns about housing, healthcare, employment, education, criminal justice. The work of Common Ground, particularly during its apex, what I consider to be its apex of 2005 and 2006, bridged rural and urban. Right? It stretched from New Orleans throughout South Louisiana, east into Mississippi, and even other places. It touched all kinds of communities in need, not just poor African-American communities. I think as we think about our charge here today, I want to offer a preliminary proposition, and it's this. There's another word for environmental racism. It's racism. Right? I mean, so which is not to discount, right, the very particular ways that environmental disparities manifest themselves in communities of color. But I think the work of Common Ground and what Malik has stood for in his life and his political activism suggests that the effects of environmental racism are inseparable from the broader fight against the interlocking forces that produce it, which is to say white supremacy and capitalism. Rebecca Solnit describes Hurricane Katrina as a quote-unquote socio-political catastrophe. The Tulane historian Andy Horowitz reminds us that Katrina cannot be understood as something that happened in August and September of 2005. Katrina was decades, and we could even argue centuries in the making. It's not an event, but a phenomenon, or as George Lipsitz called it, a conjuncture. Furthermore, I think for hundreds of thousands of New Orleanians and Gulf Coast residents, Katrina is not over. It's ongoing, it's enduring. So it's really impossible to talk about its legacy and including the realm of the environment without coming to terms with that sort of fundamental fact, right? This kind of much longer time span. So I'm thinking about environmental justice and urban social movements. I think it necessitates that we expand our time horizons, that we look beyond singular events, campaigns, or moments, right, to think about a much longer history of struggle. Struggle that doesn't always look, in sort of conventional terms like environmentalism. Which brings me to the sort of second lesson that I gleaned from the example of Malik Rahim and Common Ground. Malik has said many times to me and in public forums that there would be no common ground without the Angola Three. And there would be no Angola Three without the Black Panther Party. And I'll let him sort of elaborate on that in his own remarks. He can do it much more eloquently than me. Another way in which he's, I think, made a very similar point is in talking about the work of Common Ground. He said, this was in 2006, he said, everything I do today, which is to say about responding to the crisis of Hurricane Katrina, everything I do today, I learned from the Black Panther Party. And so for him in his life, it's very awkward to be talking about him. He's right here. That's why I'm not even looking in this direction. Because I actually thought I would follow him and be able to elaborate something, but it's all good. He has a very clear understanding of not only his place in history, but the way in which these things are all interconnected. And I think that's really important. He is very much a long-distance runner in the freedom struggle. So let me just say a bit about how I came to this, because I'm not a New Orleanian, and that's very important to know. To make a somewhat long story short, I was a graduate student in 2005 at the time of Hurricane Katrina, and was working on a dissertation on very distant matters. I had spent a little bit of time in New Orleans, had a few friends, and was, as many other Americans and people around the world were, just distressed, distraught, and really just incredibly, in some ways I was paralyzed actually by everything that I saw on TV and all the reports and that came out at that time, and I just wanted to rush and go do something and help and join in some kind of common cause. It wasn't possible, I didn't have any particular skills, and there's a whole bunch of reasons why that didn't happen, but the following summer, in May and June of 2006, I was able to participate in a small oral history project that was called Imagining New Orleans. And the idea of that project was to talk to people who are returning, and the sort of first generation of people who are returning back to the city to try to remake their lives and remake their communities. And we fanned out across the city and talked to people of all different backgrounds and asked them a series of questions, in part about their experience in the flood and the storm, but most importantly for us, their vision for the future, what they wanted to see happen. One of the people who I talked to, one of the first people I met, was Kalamu Yasalam, and I sat with him, and he taught me. We could do a whole separate panel, and I would all the praise I just gave for Malik, I could give to Kalamu and his vision, how he helped me to see things as an outsider. I didn't meet Malik Raheem then, but his work was already well known, and one of my colleagues did interview him. And I'll come back to that interview in a moment. A few years passed, and I finally decided I had to meet him. So I spent some time that summer, collected these interviews, went back to my work, started a job teaching in history and African American studies at Princeton, but New Orleans was in me. New Orleans was in me, and the struggle to remake and rebuild New Orleans was in me. And so I basically ended up returning more or less every year since then for shorter and longer periods of time. And so a few years after that, I finally decided I had to go meet this Malik Raheem, this black radical over there on the West Bank. And I got his number from somebody, and I called him up, and I expected that he would, knowing his reputation, that he would maybe welcome me, talk to me for an hour or two, and sort of send me on my way back to my Ivy League institution. And instead, we had an experience, and maybe he remembers, maybe he doesn't, but we spent about probably 8 or 10 hours together. And he took me all over the West Bank of New Orleans, to his community. Talked about the history of his family and the history of the African-American community there. We talked about common ground. We talked about the Panthers. And I walked away from that both incredibly humbled that he would, open himself to me in that way, but also determined that we would continue this conversation. And so that conversation is ongoing. We've been in dialogue, let's say, for the last 5 years or so. And in that period, I've sort of moved on from my first research project and moved towards the next one, a book project, which I'm in the early stages of, which I am tentatively entitling "The City Lives in You: The Black Freedom Struggle and the Futures of New Orleans." And what I'm interested in this project is to think about the legacies of black political organizing and the black radical tradition in New Orleans as they play out in the 1960s and 1970s in various organizations and various forms, but to trace those lineages forward to the present day and to think about and with a set of activists and thinkers like Kalamu Yasalam, like Malik Raheem, like Althea Francois, like Malcolm Suber, et cetera, a constellation of these folks who are these long distance runners. And so that's some of the work, but central to all this is the work of Malik Raheem and Common Ground. And again, I'll let Malik describe the organization and how it comes to be. So I want to just, as I move towards wrapping up, I want to talk a little bit, though, from this interview that he did in 2006 from this oral history project. This is, I've interviewed him a number of times, but this is an interview that was conducted by one of my colleagues. And as I said, in this interview, which is about hour, probably 2 hours long, talks about a range of issues, but mainly about the work of building this grassroots relief organization that brought tens of thousands of volunteers eventually to New Orleans and to the Gulf Coast. But towards the very end, the interviewer asked Malik, "What do you think this city would be in 10 years?" This is May of 2006. So projecting out in a decade. This is something that we asked all of our interviewees. And I'm going to read from this at length because I think it's important. Malik says, "I think this is going to be probably the most progressive city in the world. I believe it's going to be a city that tourism is going to play a major role because everybody's going to want to come here to see just what we were able to accomplish. I believe this is going to be an environmentally clean city. It could be a city of great opportunity. I could see it as a city that individuals are going to come to learn what to do for how to clean up a toxic environment. I could see more universities, or either the 6 major universities that exist in the city, increasing. I would love to see in these 10 years that the enrollment at Xavier and Dillard at Southern increase maybe 10, 15-fold, with people from right here, that's taking advantage of it. I could see the creation of another progressive hospital or black hospital. We had one once, one of the few in America, Flint Goodrich. I could see us developing that kind of mechanism again. I could see us becoming the example of community health clinics and the importance of preventive medicine. Oh yeah, I could see many of these opportunities 10 years from now. I have great hopes for New Orleans. I have great hope for America." And the interviewer then asked him, "Do you think these things will happen?" "Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. I say because we have no other choice. Because if it don't happen, we're going to destroy ourselves. Listen, we could stop global warming right now and leave it for our children to stop it. Listen, we don't stop global warming right now, leave it for our children to stop it, it's going to be too late. If we don't deal with the developing environmental response to our blatant neglect, we're doomed. We got to set this. It's the duty of our generation right here. We caused it. We need to set a mechanism to fix it. We need to deal with our national debt." And he goes on from there. And so just to finish. We need to look at this. I could see this city having a storm protection system that's going to be the marvel of the world. Where one time our canal system was the marvel of our world. I could see us developing that again. I could see us restoring our wetland. I could see that if we come together right now by 2050, that half of the wetlands that we have lost are to be restored. He goes on and on and on. He says, we have to do these things. We have to do it. It's imperative, right? And in the work, again, is the way in which Common Ground and Malik's work, that none of this can be separated from questions of criminal justice. None of this can be separated from housing issues. None of this can be separated from employment issues. None of this can be separated from the mental health issues, the PTSD that folks have suffered in the wake of Katrina. These things are all related, and we don't prioritize one over the other. Malik assigns all of his emails. Yours in the struggle for environmental peace and justice, and that to me is his legacy, and I look forward to hearing from Cindi and from Malik himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua, for that presentation. So I would just like to offer a few comments and open the floor for discussion or any questions that you would like to ask of him regarding his presentation. You know, one of the things that you bring out in your presentation is this idea of the notion of the historical construction of environmental inequality, and the reality that these grassroots activism are a part of our epistemologies and are part of our intellectualizing of the overall narrative of the environmental movement. And so I open up the floor to anyone who would like to ask a question or have a comment. Yes.
What's the assumption that the difference between a scholar and the activist?
You're asking us what is the difference between...
No, not what is. What's the assumption? Why is there that assumption? Why do you think that thinking is not working?
Well, we actually agree with you. I think rather than looking at it as an antagonistic relationship, it's more of a complementary relationship in which activists and scholars work together in the sense that the scholarship that we do actually goes into communities and it intellectualizes your work and it presents...
Let me be clear, because I'm not communicating. I don't mean to cut you off. I'm not communicating to you the question I'm asking. I'm asking, you saying that there's a relationship between the two? I'm saying, why do we see a dichotomy at all? Why do we think that the activist is not a thinker and the thinker is not an activist?
I'm agreeing with you. I don't think... Well, first let me actually open it up to the panel. Okay.
I mean, I certainly don't see. I don't subscribe to that separation at all. I mean, that was why I started the way I did, and that absolutely that activists are thinkers, and that the ideas that they generate often come through action, through the practice, through the work of that. But they also come from life experience and all kinds of, I don't subscribe to that kind of separation. That separation does, I mean, if the question also is, why in our society do we see that's I think a separate thing. We could talk about that, but I certainly don't see those things as at all separate or separate in any meaningful way.
May I ask you a question? Well, two. I get the sense that there's a... Do you think that there's a separation? Do you think that your work is not a part of the canon, is not a part of the scholarship? What is the underlying thread?
The underlying thing is that we, as human beings, we do and think, and that any human being who is not credited as a thinker is not fully human. And any human being who makes their living primarily thinking about things and not doing about things is not fully human. and that the academy in general looks upon their task as understanding things. But that process of understanding things is, in fact, when we look at it closely, the academy is in the service of explaining why the system is good. Even when they tell us it's wrong, it's usually from a reformative standpoint, pointing out how we can make it better and so forth and so on. The revolutionary objective is to do away with this system. And we cannot do away with this system simply by reforming it, whether in thought or in action.
Well, once again, you know, I agree with you. In the work that I do, for instance, my work on environmental justice, I specifically let me address your question really quickly. So for specifically what I do is I look at the historical construction of environmental inequalities, and I privilege experiences the activism of African Americans historically. For instance, when I work on 19th century history, I look at the existential frameworks that the enslaved used, and through the Negro spirituals, through going into the forest and interacting with nature as a part of their activism and as a part of their theoretical framework. So that's just one light, specifically as well with the civil rights movement. I look at how people in their everyday lives, not only did they act on their on premises of knowledge, but they actually created knowledge. And so there is a conversation there that privileges both, and I don't see it as an antagonistic relationship. And so I would like to invite our second panelist to speak, please, for time. Yes.
Okay, well, I need not say who I am. Josh did a remarkable job on that. All right. How about now? Like I said, I need not say who I am. Josh did a remarkable job on that. Part of the things I wanted to say, he stated. Because I stand firm on this statement, that common ground in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina and Rita served over 500,000 people and a multitude of services. We opened up 4 health clinics. We housed over 300 families. We gutted out over half of the homes in the lower 9th Ward, which had more than 1,200 of its residents to die in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. We serve residents in 19 parishes in Louisiana, and parishes is like counties. 3 counties in Mississippi, and 2 counties in Alabama. We was the first to provide service to the Native American community, the Vietnamese community, Cajun community. Almost half of those that we served was African American. And it wouldn't have been a common ground if it wouldn't have been an Angola 3. And it wouldn't have, and for those who don't know the story of the Angola 3, these are 3 political prisoners. One, Robert King Wilkerson, served 29 years in solitary confinement for a crime that they knew he didn't commit because he was in Orleans Parish Prison when the crime was committed in Angola State Penitentiary of Louisiana. Herman Wallace, who served 41 years in solitary confinement, who died 2 years ago yesterday. I'm sorry, was released 2 years ago yesterday, and died on the 4th. Albert Woodfox, who's now entering his 43rd year of solitary confinement for a crime that he was convicted of twice and had it overturned twice. And our state is about to try him again. Only because of the last thing, the Black Panther Party. I was a member, and I am now a member of the National Alumni Association of the Black Panther Party. In New Orleans, I was involved in the first shootout between the police and members of the party. I've served time in prison, served time on death row. I've been in many prison riots, but nothing compared me for the aftermath of Katrina. For this stand, I may speak anywhere around the country. Never invited to speak in New Orleans. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary of Katrina. I wasn't asked to speak at any event. Almost 90% of the people in the Ninth Ward received services from our organization. But I wasn't asked to speak. But I come from one of the most blessed, and I'm gonna tell you right now, I'm a very spiritual person. I'm not religious. So even though I may have an Islamic name, I'm not a Muslim. And even though I come from a Christian community, I'm not a Christian. But I'm very spiritual. And I live and work under the premise that the key to success is faith in the Most High, confidence in oneself, and be willing to make a sacrifice. I believe with those three elements, you will always be successful. I've been blessed to be around some of the greatest and most strongest men I've ever met in my life. And the angle of three, there's three of them. Whatever hardships I've been through in my life, I could always look at the hardships that they are enduring, and they keep me moving on. Like Josh said, I have 7 children, 5 sons and 2 daughters. I have 21 grandkids and 6 great-grandkids. And for them, I continue to struggle. Because I don't want them to ever say that the legacy that their grandfather left them is a dying planet. And that's what's at stake. I'm a firm believer that so goes the Gulf Coast, so goes America. So goes America, so goes life as we know it on this planet. Yes, I'm a victim of racism. I've lived through Jim Crowism. I've seen a lot in my life. But it become mute if you give me all the rights that I wish for me and my family. It would become absolutely worthless if they cannot breathe this air or drink fresh water. And that's what's at stake. We are in America. We are so blessed. Blessed to the degree that we could use fresh drinking water to flush down our feces, while other people around the world is dying for the lack thereof. And we don't care, because we have become so drunk on prosperity that we no longer care. Our legacy, like Josh said, to the future generation, I'm 68 years old. At least I'll be 68 in 2 months. Our legacy to you young people is to clean up the mess that we have created. I came here on train. Took me a day and a half to get here. And for every hour of my travel here, we have lost a football field of wetlands. And as I go back, we're going to be steady losing a football field. Because one of the greatest ongoing natural disaster is the loss of the wetlands in the Gulf Coast. You might say, well, hey, we up here. But most of the refineries of petroleum is in the Gulf Coast. Most of your most toxic chemical refineries is on the Gulf Coast. If you would, she just passed me a note saying I have 5 minutes, but I'm gonna tell you, I'm gonna take 10.
Take all of it.
Most of this damage need not happen. We have the technology, we have the ability to restore our wetlands. But we refuse to, because we have placed all our emphasis on building levees, forgetting the fact that the flooding that happened in New Orleans didn't happen because of Hurricane Katrina. It's happened because of the failures of levees. But here we are, because we are so drunk on prosperity, we go back into the same way. If we would just stop navigational dredging and go to restorational dredging, we could start restoring our wetlands. But this is something that we refuse to do. And if we refuse to do the work that we know we can do, how can we expect to do the work that need to be done and we don't know how? I come to this university like I speak, and I very seldom leave my community. I come here now only for one reason: for it to be documented for your generation that all of us wasn't drunk on prosperity, that it was an old gray-haired roster that came here to Brown University and said that you need to act, that you need to make sure that we don't leave you with the task that we should be doing now, to make you push us into doing what needs to be done. In Louisiana, we will be electing a new governor in November. Next year, we'll be electing a new president. Let's no longer elect people on 30-second or minute sound bites. Let's push to them, what will they do? How are they gonna deal with all the weapons of mass destruction that exist in America that 40 years from now will be antiquated? How are you gonna deal with them? How are you gonna deal with a failed infrastructure that exists now? How are you gonna deal with it? Don't allow this generation, my generation, to pass on in this drunken state. Wake us up. Let's understand there's nothing more important right now than the struggle for environmental peace and justice. And with that, I'm gonna conclude.
Amazing. We'll go on to Cindi, and then we'll open up the floor so that we all can, I know you have questions and comments after his speech, so I'll let you speak.
Good morning, everybody. That I am honored to be on, and daunted and humbled to be between these two, and to have heard what you just said, and I feel like it's cliche to say a tough act to follow. It's a revolutionary moment, and I just have some blah blah. So have patience. Anyway, I really am honored to be here, and I thank Tricia and Jordan and George and Caitlin and Christina for making this possible and for bringing us together. And one of the things that Malik said yesterday is this group of people did not ever get together in New Orleans. Sometimes it takes the money of an institution like Brown to make it happen, but it's part of the politics of keeping people separate and running their engines on trying to get a bit of resources. So it's really a profound possibility for thinking about the future and doing something about it. My work is about social reproduction, and just to be quick about what, oh, is it not? Yeah. I could tell that was the, speak louder. Social reproduction is about remaking the world on a daily basis and on a generational basis and on a multi-generational basis. It's both biological reproduction and it's the reproduction of social formations. in all of their unevenness and in all of their possibilities. So it's the messy, fleshy kinds of practices of everyday life, the stuff we do, the breakfast, the cleaning, the cooking, but it's also the structured practices that they're connected to that are classed, racialized, gendered, and woefully uneven. So social reproduction in a kind of Marxist analysis is understood to reproduce a labor force, a differentiated labor force, different skills, different knowledge, different expectations, but also the forces and means of production, the things it takes to put those into practice in work every day. And that means it includes the built environment and the so-called, but utterly transformed, as we've been hearing, natural environment. So it's about making a livable, workable world, but it's right now remaking and making the social relations of capitalism, of racial capitalism, of patriarchal relations, and it's also the kinds of practices that naturalize those relationships, so that make them common sense, so that we are all implicated in making the conditions in which we live. And so social reproduction, on the one hand, is precisely about reproduction, not revolutionary, but in its practices, in its forms, cultural forms, material social practices, actions, activities of everyday life, and the bigger political struggles that we're involved in, is the possibility to make a different world, a world that we could survive in. So social reproduction, hello, is...
That's me.
Is it? It's you? It wasn't enough.
Yeah,
I had to follow what he said. He's interrupted. It's one of the 21 grandchildren. Probably my mother. Social reproduction is at the heart, and I mean that in every sense, at the heart of capitalism and also at the heart of its transformation. So that love, as Sunny was performing last night, is very much a part of what happens in the course of in the course of social reproduction. But it's also that much of the labor that we associate with it is now called caring work, but it's carried out a lot and largely by women and people of color. But it includes education, healthcare, social justice, housing, the environment, and the kind of conditions in which we live, work, and play. It takes place through some shift in combination, and the shift in the relationship among these things is the outcome of ongoing struggle from the household, from the workplace or through capital, from civil society or the nonprofit industrial complex, and the state. And so there's a lot of juggling among those sites to accomplish what needs to be accomplished, and they're associated with places that are familiar in all of our lives: home, school, the streets, the justice and injustice system, and various cultural institutions. But social reproduction is also geographically and historically situated and specific. So over the past 40 years, its conditions in the US and more broadly have been those associated with neoliberal racial capitalism, with global aspirations and with global reach, but with intimate and local and global effects. So this social formation is associated with, by now, the familiar effects of market logics for everything: privatization, capital reneging on all of its commitments to any particular place or any particular population or labor force, offloading the responsibility for social reproduction onto individuals, households, poorer populations, onto the private sector, which has its own ways of supporting. Again, this is supporting the state and supporting the status quo in maintaining these relations which are exploitative and destructive. And it's also in this neoliberal global capitalism, there's a despoiling of the environments without regard for their sustainability, except for sustainable capitalism, so that capital can destroy this place and move on to that place, use those resources and then move on. So it has no real commitment to sustaining life that's healthy and productive in the deepest sense kind of life. So Katrina, as is well known, exposed these conditions, and it was a disaster as opposed to a storm because of these conditions, because of decades and longer of this sort of dispossession, this kind of these woefully uneven conditions of everyday life, and it exposed that the kind of failed, disinvested, dispossessing nature of housing, of infrastructure, of the open spaces of everyday life, as much as the kind of environmental hubris, which Malik was just talking about, and deprivation, the effects of a state like the Army Corps of Engineers, working for the petroleum and chemical industries and not for the population who lived there. I feel that 5-minute warning is probably coming soon. So when we talk about environmental justice, we are not just talking about toxic exposure or pollution or racialized class landscapes of waste-making production, but we're also talking about the everyday environments where people live, work, and play, to use Giovanna De Curo's definition of environmental justice. And these are always already uneven, but again, the storm exposed the hideousness of that divide, the willful failure of the state and capital to redress and respond to these conditions of inadequate housing, of toxic exposure, to poor to non-existent play spaces, and infrastructural devastation. These are questions of environmental justice, and they reveal the disposability of some places and some populations and the value of others. It is structured disposability. The enduring fruits for capital of accumulation by dispossession, of displacement, of organized abandonment, disregard, and containment of certain populations and places. So if these social relations of production and reproduction were exposed to harsher light by Katrina, that could not be kept as invisible, although there was certainly a lot of work to naturalize and hide these effects. Katrina also produced an alibi for putting them on steroids, basically. So for continuing the agenda, which was well in place to privatize schools, busting an entire strong teachers union, privatizing healthcare, shutting down Charity Hospital and other places where healthcare was provided, privatization of housing, destroying public housing, privatization of public spaces, changing the footprint of New Orleans, but not in the way that Malik is talking about. These dispossessions and accumulations were already happening, of course, but Katrina enabled the most rapacious, the most mendacious, the most venal forms of them to continue to occur, displacing still, a decade later, more than 118,000 black residents, reducing the young population, talking about an ecology for the future, from 27% before in 2000 to 23% of the total population now, and that is something to really think about as a question of environmental justice. I should say that while 118,000 black residents have not returned, only 24,000 white residents have not returned. So the agenda of whitening and gentrifying and making it an exciting city for tourists and wealthy people is galloping apace, and hollowing out long-standing black neighborhoods by conscious strategies. And so the road home was bad enough for people who actually own property, but for renters it was non-existent. There's still no repairs to many parts of the city that the tourists don't see, so there can be all kinds of proud talking about how New Orleans has come back. Charter schools, which are abject failures but produce lying statistics that make them sound good, without talking about how many students they push out to have those statistics, and without a care to where those students are, because the one place where the state has not disinvested, the carceral and the military, I guess those are two places, but they're kind of connected, is a place to contain and manage those populations of kids. Contain, manage, sicken, and kill them. Okay. I work on social reproduction because I think it's possible to change the world, and the older I get, the more kind of devastating I get about it. But I want to stop talking about the bad. I'm sitting next to somebody who filled in part of a collective that jumped in at that moment to make something different happen, where the state and capital didn't fail. They succeeded in their agenda. That's what they meant to do. But their failures were killing people that Common Ground Collective and other organizations helped to redress. But I want to just end by talking about the possibilities that social reproduction provides. And we've seen some of that, as I just said, with the Common Ground Collective. It's not bad. I usually fail on this time-space compression. And organized around the failures and the kind of refusals of the state and capital and their sugar-coated allies, the nonprofit industrial complex. But as an example, I want to just add a few thoughts, and maybe we'll be able to address them in discussion, about social reproduction as a place and a practice for social mobilization and for politics. I used to think social reproduction was impossible to organize around because it's nowhere in particular. There's no shop floor for social reproduction. But in fact, it's everywhere. It's all kinds of practices. It's all these things that are connected, which was part of what Malik was saying. And so that given that it's everywhere but kind of nowhere, it's part of the trick of social reproduction under capitalism to make it naturalized, to make it a labor of love. Now, without diminishing that love, in fact, recognizing and rerouting it is a politics that would build community in community around all of these connected parts of social reproduction: housing, incarceration, the poor school districts, crappy parks and playgrounds, unhealthy environments. These are each enough for political mobilization, but connecting them as interlocking spheres through which people and social relations are made and remade in all of their differences, which are both hideous differences and potentially beautiful differences, provides movement-building opportunities around social reproduction, like the Black Panther Party, like the Common Ground Collective, like the Wages for Housework, which was a way of making women see that their oppression in the home, not to be paid for, but to organize around, to get out and see that those conditions are widespread. They are not the isolated things that they seem. But also, social reproduction is everywhere in the world. And what's happening in New Orleans is not unique. In fact, it's the leading edge, as Clyde Woods warned us. So what gives us a different kind of, that gives us a different kind of opportunity to organize in a way that connects not just those different sites of social reproduction, but the different places where it's happening. So when I went to New Orleans after Katrina, one of the people that I met was Kali Akuno, who was then the director of the People's Hurricane Relief Fund, and talked about what can I do? I, who live in New York City, who am an academic and an activist there, and can't come down very often to do stuff. And of course, we have these same things going on, perhaps less extremely visible, but they're happening in New York. They're happening in Providence. They're happening in Los Angeles. And organizing where we live around those things, but connecting to the other places where they're happening is a political project. Capital's mobility can be stopped in that way by saying, oh, we have this same disinvestment. We have the same shitty schools. We are also being displaced. The money is not going to restoration. It's going to improve, to gentrify and to improve the tourist environment. So the translocal questions raised by social reproduction are something that we can organize around and find common ground in different places, at different times, and in different, and with and with all of you collectively working together. Thank you. All of us.
Such a powerful panel.